The mystery of the Indus Valley Civilization, the lost, mysterious city. It's a story that unfolds not with a thunderous clash of armies or the proclamations of a famous king, but with a profound and unsettling silence. Imagine, if you will, a civilization sprawling across an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, a network of sophisticated cities with urban planning that would make a modern engineer nod in appreciation. They had writing, trade networks stretching for thousands of miles, and a culture so stable it lasted for the better part of a millennium. And yet, we don't know their real name, the names of their rulers, the nature of their gods, or the stories they told their children. Their script remains an undeciphered whisper on thousands of tiny stone seals, a lock without a key. For centuries, their very existence was forgotten, buried under the shifting sands and silts of Pakistan and Western India, a historical ghost haunting the subcontinent. It's one of history's greatest cold cases, a civilization on a truly massive scale that simply vanished, leaving behind meticulously ordered ruins and a silence that echoes louder than any pharaoh's boast. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, I'd love for you to drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always a quiet thrill to see where in the world people are listening from as we drift back in time together. The story of their reappearance begins, as so many colonial stories do, with a railway. In the 1850s, British engineers were laying tracks across the Punjab, a vast and sun-scorched plain. Needing ballast for the railway bed, that crushed rock that provides stability, they stumbled upon an ancient, ruined city. The local villagers had known about the place for generations, calling it Harappa. For them, it was simply a convenient quarry, a source of strangely uniform, high-quality fired bricks, which they had been happily recycling into their own homes for years. The engineers, blissfully unaware that they were grinding up a Bronze Age metropolis, followed suit. They dismantled walls and foundations, packing the rubble of a lost world under iron rails, carrying the weight of progress. For decades, countless tons of priceless archaeological evidence were pulverized into ballast, and no one was the wiser. The silent city gave up its bones to the industrial age without a whisper of protest. It wasn't until the 1920s that the true significance of Harappa and another, even larger site, found hundreds of miles to the south, called Mohenjo-Daro, the Mound of the Dead, came to light. Under the directions of archaeologists like Rai Bahadur, Dayaram Sahni, and R.D. Banerjee, and overseen by Sir John Marshall of the Archaeological Survey of India, the world was forced to radically rethink its understanding of ancient history. Before these digs, the story of India was thought to begin much, much later, with the arrival of Vedic peoples around 1500 BCE. But the artifacts being pulled from the earth at Mohenjo-Daro were undeniably older, much older. Here were the ruins of a massive planned city that flourished between 2500 and 1900 BCE, a contemporary of the Great Pyramids of Giza and the ziggurats of Ur. It was as if historians had discovered a lost chapter of humanity's story, a chapter whose existence no one had ever suspected. The sheer scale of it was, and still is, staggering. The Indus Valley Civilization, or the Harappan civilization, as it is also known, was not a handful of settlements. It was a network of over 1,000 towns and cities spread across 1 million square kilometers, from the foothills of the Himalayas to the shimmering coast of the Arabian Sea. This was the most geographically extensive civilization of the entire ancient world. And at its heart were its magnificent cities, monuments to an almost obsessive sense of order. Mohenjo-Daro was a masterpiece of urban design. It was built on a grid plan, with main streets running north-south and east-west, wide enough for 2 ox carts to pass each other. Off these main arteries branched smaller lanes, leading to residential blocks. The houses, often 2 stories high, were constructed from those same standardized, kiln-fired bricks that the railway builders had so admired. This uniformity is a crucial clue. The bricks found at Mohenjo-Daro are the same size and ratio as those found at Harappa, 400 miles away. This suggests a level of central coordination, a shared system of weights and measures, and a cultural cohesion that is simply mind-boggling for the 3rd millennium BCE. Most homes had their own private wells and, remarkably, their own bathrooms. Clay pipes running from the houses fed into a complex city-wide network of covered drains that ran under the main streets. This was the world's first known urban sanitation system, a feat of engineering that wouldn't be rivaled in many parts of the world for another 4,000 years. The city was divided into 2 main parts: a lower town where the bulk of the population lived and worked, and a raised, fortified acropolis or citadel. On this citadel at Mohenjo-Daro stood the city's most impressive structures, including a massive granary for storing communal food supplies and a mysterious building known as the Great Bath. This sunken, brick-lined pool, waterproofed with bitumen, was precisely constructed, with steps leading down into the water. It was likely used for ritual purification, a place for sacred bathing central to the city's spiritual life. But without any texts to guide us, its true purpose, like so much else, remains a matter of educated guesswork. It stands as a silent testament to a belief system we can no longer access, its still waters reflecting only the endless sky and our own questioning faces. That profound sense of order, visible in the silent, empty basin of the Great Bath and the rigid grid of the city streets, extended into every facet of Harappan life. Stepping down from the citadel, one would have entered a world humming with a quiet and purposeful industry. The lower town was a labyrinth of residential blocks, each one a testament to the Harappan flair for pragmatic design. Remember those standardized bricks? They were used to build homes that were remarkably similar in their basic layout, creating a visual harmony, an almost democratic aesthetic across the cityscape. A typical house was built around a central courtyard, a private open space that allowed sunlight and fresh air to filter into the surrounding rooms, while keeping the dust of the public street at bay. This design provided a cool refuge from the intense heat of the Indus Valley summers, and suggests a life that valued the family unit and a degree of privacy. There were no grand windows facing the main thoroughfares. Instead, doorways opened onto the smaller, quieter side lanes. Inside, the rooms were functional, with flattened clay floors and walls plastered with mud. The presence of stairwells in many ruins indicates that 2-story dwellings were common, effectively doubling the living space on a compact footprint. And of course, there was the feature that continues to astonish: the private bathrooms and the integrated drainage. To think of a common family 5,000 years ago having access to a dedicated bathing platform and a toilet, all neatly connected to a subterranean sewer system, is to recognize a society that placed an immense value on hygiene and civic infrastructure. It was a level of municipal service that would vanish and not reappear in the region for thousands of years. But this very uniformity presents us with one of the civilization's deepest mysteries. As archaeologists have excavated these thousands of comfortable, well-built homes, they have found a conspicuous absence of palaces. There are no monumental royal residences, no sprawling complexes that dwarf their surroundings and announce the singular power of a king or emperor. There are public structures, yes, the granaries, the baths, the assembly halls, but no home for a pharaoh. This raises a tantalizing question. Who was in charge? How was this vast, orderly, and standardized world governed? Was it ruled by a council of elites, perhaps wealthy merchants, or a powerful priesthood who governed from the citadel? Or was the order maintained not by rulers, but by a deeply ingrained and universally accepted set of cultural norms? The cities seem to function like a perfectly coordinated machine, but the seat of the driver remains mysteriously empty. The hum of daily life would have been the sound of artisans at work. The Harappans were master craftspeople, and their workshops were scattered throughout the city. Potters spun their wheels, producing vast quantities of distinctive glossy red and black pottery, decorated with geometric patterns or graceful images of animals and pipal leaves. In other quarters, metallurgists worked their forges. They were skilled in the challenging arts of copper and bronze casting, creating not just durable tools like axes, knives, and fishhooks, but also delicate works of art. The most famous of these is the small bronze statuette known as the Dancing Girl from Mohenjo-Daro. Just 10 centimeters tall, she is captured in a moment of poised relaxation, one hand on her hip, her head tilted back with an air of confident nonchalance. Her slim form is adorned with bangles, and her hair is intricately styled. She is not a goddess or a queen, but seemingly an ordinary person, imbued with an extraordinary living personality that transcends the 5 millennia separating her from us. Other workshops specialized in bead making, a true Harappan obsession. They worked with a variety of precious materials. Lapis lazuli of the deepest blue, imported all the way from the mountains of what is now Afghanistan, shimmering turquoise from Persia, and carnelian, a rich reddish-orange stone which they mined in the regions of Gujarat. They developed an incredibly sophisticated technique for drilling impossibly long, thin holes through these hard stones to create elegant necklaces and belts that were coveted across the ancient world. Harappan beads have been found in the royal graves of Ur in Mesopotamia, a clear sign of a thriving, long-distance trade relationship. This was a civilization that was not isolated, but was a key player in the first great globalized economy, connected by sea and by land to the other great powers of the Bronze Age. Their merchants likely used the hundreds of small, intricately carved stone seals we found to mark their goods, pressing the unique symbols into wet clay as a mark of ownership, a kind of ancient shipping label or corporate logo. These seals, each a miniature masterpiece, are our most intimate connection to the Harappan mind, and yet they remain our greatest barrier. They are covered in that beautiful, cryptic script, and until it is deciphered, we can only guess at the names of the merchants, the goods they traded, or the deals they struck. For now, we see only the images that accompany the writing. The powerful bull, the formidable elephant, the ferocious tiger, and most common of all, a strange, one-horned creature that looks for all the world like a unicorn. Those enigmatic unicorn seals and the confident gaze of the bronze dancing girl represented the Harappan civilization at its zenith, a world of remarkable stability that lasted for some 700 years. For generations, life in cities like Mohenjo-Daro must have felt predictable, secure, and permanent. The streets were clean, the granaries were full, and the trade routes hummed with activity. Theirs was a world built to last, forged from millions of standardized bricks and an unshakable sense of order. And yet, it ended. Beginning around 1900 BCE, this intricate and sprawling urban world began to unravel. It wasn't a sudden, cataclysmic event, but a slow, creeping decline, a great machine grinding to a halt over the course of centuries. The great cities began to empty, the elegant script disappeared, and the vast trade networks fell silent. The silence that now hangs over the ruins is the echo of this final, great mystery. Why did it all fall apart? For a long time, the most popular and dramatic explanation was a story of conquest. In the 1940s, the archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler, excavating at Mohenjo-Daro, discovered several groups of skeletons in the upper layers of the city, seemingly unburied and left in the streets where they fell. He connected this grim discovery with passages from the Rigveda, the earliest sacred text of the Indo-Aryans, which describes its warrior god Indra as Puramdara, the fort destroyer who shatters ancient citadels. A powerful and evocative narrative was born. The peaceful, sophisticated, city-dwelling Harappans were overrun and destroyed by waves of chariot-riding, bronze-wielding Indo-Aryan invaders sweeping down from the Central Asian steppes. It was a compelling story, a clash of civilizations that explained the sudden disappearance of one and the emergence of another. For decades, this was the standard theory, a dramatic final act for the Indus Valley people. However, as more evidence came to light, the cinematic visions of invasion began to crumble. Closer examination of the skeletons revealed that they didn't all date to the same time period and showed no signs of violent, battle-related injuries. They were more likely victims of disease or some other misfortune. Furthermore, extensive excavations across hundreds of Harappan sites have failed to turn up any evidence of a massive, fiery destruction layer that would point to a widespread conquest. There are no weapon hordes, no shattered walls, no signs of a final, desperate battle. The great citadels, once imagined as mighty fortresses, are now understood to be ceremonial or administrative centers, not military strongholds. The invasion theory, while dramatic, simply doesn't fit the quiet and gradual abandonment that the archaeological record now shows. The Harappans were not victims of a climactic battle, but of something more insidious and perhaps far more powerful: the slow, unforgiving forces of nature. Today, the leading theory centers on the environment, and specifically on the lifeblood of the civilization, its rivers. The Harappans built their world in the floodplain of the mighty Indus River and, crucially, along the banks of another vast river system known as the Ghaggar Hakra, which flowed parallel to the Indus. For centuries, this network of waterways provided the predictable annual floods that irrigated their fields and made their agricultural surplus possible. But geological and paleoclimatological studies have revealed that the climate in South Asia began to change around the turn of the second millennium BCE. The powerful summer monsoons, which fed the rivers, started to weaken and become more erratic. This would have been catastrophic. For the Harappan farmer, it meant the life-giving floods he relied upon were no longer dependable. Some years they might not come at all, leaving fields to crack and bake under the relentless sun. The Ghaggar Hakra river system seems to have been particularly vulnerable. Fed by runoff from the Himalayan foothills, its sources may have shifted due to tectonic activity, diverting its water into other river basins. Slowly but surely, this once mighty river, whose dry bed is now wider than the Indus in places, began to dwindle, reducing to a series of seasonal lakes, before disappearing into the desert sands entirely. Hundreds of Harappan settlements that depended on it were left high and dry. The great cities, with their dense populations, their artisans, and their ruling elites, could no longer be supported by the shrinking agricultural base. The carefully balanced system that fed millions began to break down. People would have started to drift away from the urban centers, abandoning the brick-lined streets and covered drains for smaller, more sustainable farming villages to the east and south. The emptying of the cities wasn't an act of war, but an act of survival. This environmental crisis was likely compounded by other stresses. The breakdown of their long-distance trade with Mesopotamia, which we know faltered around the same time, would have cut off a vital source of wealth and prestige goods. It's also possible that the very rigidity that made their civilization so stable for so long became its fatal flaw. A culture built on uniformity and tradition may have struggled to adapt and innovate in the face of such a profound and unprecedented environmental shift. The result was a system's collapse, a domino effect where a changing climate crippled agriculture, which in turn undermined the economy and led to the gradual abandonment of the cities that were the heart of their culture. It wasn't a sudden death, but a long twilight. The people didn't vanish, but their urban way of life did. The legacy of the great cities was lost as the population scattered, and with them faded the knowledge of their script, their sanitation systems, and the quiet, well-ordered world they had so painstakingly built. Into the quiet lands of this long twilight, where the ghosts of the great brick cities slept under growing mounds of earth, new voices began to be heard. The decline of the Harappan urban culture created a vacuum, a landscape of scattered, smaller-scale agricultural communities. It was into this transformed world that a new people with a different language, a different social structure, and a different way of seeing the universe began to arrive. Their coming was not a single, thunderous event, but a gradual process, stretching over centuries, a pivotal and still hotly debated shift that would fundamentally reshape the destiny of the subcontinent. These were the people who called themselves the Arya, a word in their language simply meaning noble or honorable. They are known to history as the Indo-Aryans. To understand who they were, we must first understand that we are not talking about a distinct biological race, but about speakers of a language. The term Indo-Aryan is a linguistic one, referring to the people who spoke an early form of Sanskrit. This language belonged to a vast and ancient family of languages known as Proto-Indo-European. Thousands of years ago, perhaps on the vast grassy steppes north of the Black and Caspian Seas, what is today Ukraine and southern Russia, lived a people whose language would improbably become the ancestor to hundreds of modern tongues. Over millennia, tribes migrated out from this homeland in all directions. Some went west into Europe, their language evolving into Greek, Latin, Celtic, Germanic, and Slavic branches. Others went south into Anatolia and Persia, and one group, the Indo-Aryans, traveled east across the Iranian plateau and through the high mountain passes of the Hindu Kush, eventually trickling down into the plains of northern India. Their language carries the DNA of this shared ancestry. The Sanskrit word for father, apitits, is uncannily similar to the Latin pater, the Greek pater, and the English father. The word for three, trias, is a clear cousin to the Latin tres and the English three. These are not coincidences, but linguistic fossils, echoes of a single, long-lost mother tongue, spoken around a campfire some 6,000 years ago. These Indo-Aryan speakers brought with them a culture starkly different from that of the urban Harappans. They were not city builders, but semi-nomadic pastoralists. Their wealth was not in granaries filled with grain, but in herds of cattle, which they prized above all else. They were organized into tribes and clans, led by chieftains or petty kings known as Rajans, whose authority depended on their success in protecting the tribe, and crucially, in acquiring more cattle, often through raiding their neighbors. They were also masters of a game-changing military technology. The light, spoked wheel chariot, pulled by swift horses. While the Harappans had lumbering ox carts, the Indo-Aryans had a fast, mobile platform for warfare and prestige that gave them a significant advantage in the fragmented, post-urban landscape. So how did this arrival unfold? Remember the old theory of a violent, sweeping invasion that annihilated the Indus Valley Civilization? As we saw, the evidence for that grand, cinematic battle is simply not there. The modern consensus paints a much more complex and drawn-out picture, one that scholars now refer to as a process of migration and cultural assimilation. It wasn't a single unified army that burst through the Khyber Pass. Instead, it was likely a slow trickle of different tribes and clans moving into the subcontinent over a period of 400 or 500 years, beginning around 1900 BCE. They would have come in small waves, seeking fresh pastures for their herds, driven by climate pressures in their own lands. This was not a case of an advanced culture overwhelming a primitive one. In many ways, the post-Harappan peoples the Indo-Aryans encountered were the inheritors of a more materially sophisticated, settled tradition. But the newcomers possessed a robust and mobile social structure, a powerful religious and poetic tradition, and that key technological edge in the horse and chariot. There would have been conflict, certainly. The newcomers' own hymns, which we will soon explore, are filled with stories of battles. But these are mostly descriptions of skirmishes between different Indo-Aryan tribes, or between the Aryans and the local indigenous peoples they called the Dasa, or Dasyu. The overall picture is less one of conquest and more one of a slow, complex fusion. Indo-Aryan groups would have settled, intermarried with local populations, and gradually their language and aspects of their patriarchal, pastoral, and priestly culture became dominant across the northern plains. It was a slow seeping in, not a tidal wave, a gradual absorption and blending that would lay the foundations for a completely new chapter in India's story. The echoes of Harappan culture never truly died, but were woven into this new tapestry, creating a synthesis that would become the basis of classical Indian civilization. These newcomers, the speakers of this ancient Sanskrit, built no great cities of brick to rival Mohenjo-Daro. Their monuments were not architectural, but ethereal, constructed not from stone and mortar, but from sound and memory. As they settled in the lush, river-fed plains of the Punjab, a region they called the Sapta Sindhu, the land of the seven rivers, their priestly poets, the Aryas, began to compose an extraordinary collection of hymns. This collection, known as the Rigveda, stands as the foundational text of Hinduism and our only true window into the world of the early Vedic period. It is the echo of those new voices, preserved across the millennia, offering us an intimate, if sometimes hazy, glimpse into the lives, fears, and beliefs of the Indo-Aryan people. For at least 1,000 years, the Rigveda was not a written book. It was an entirely oral tradition, a vast library of sacred knowledge stored in the minds of successive generations of Brahmin priests. Imagine the discipline, the sheer mnemonic power required. A young student would spend years with his teacher, learning to recite every hymn, every word, every syllable with perfect pitch and intonation. The sounds themselves were believed to contain a divine power, and so any error in pronunciation would render the ritual ineffective. This meticulous process of transmission ensured that the hymns composed around 1500 BCE were passed down like a flawless genetic code of sound until they were finally committed to writing sometime after 500 BCE. This incredible feat of memorization is perhaps the first great miracle of this new age, a testament to a culture that valued the spoken word as the highest and most potent form of reality. Listening to the Rigveda is to enter a world profoundly different from our own. The 1028 hymns are addressed to a pantheon of powerful, vivid gods who personify the forces of nature. Chief among them is the boisterous and formidable Indra, a warrior god who rides a celestial chariot, wields a thunderbolt, and loves to drink the intoxicating ritual beverage, Soma. He is the god of storms and war, the one who slays the great cosmic serpent, Vritra, to release the waters and bring life to the land. Remember his title, Puramdara, the fort destroyer? This is the god of a people familiar with conflict, who saw the divine in the fury of the storm and the glory of battle. Then there is Agni, the god of fire. He is the divine messenger, the priest of the gods, the mouth through which they consume the offerings made by humans. Every Vedic ritual centered on a sacred fire, and Agni was the indispensable link between the earthly and the divine realms. His hymns are filled with reverence and affection, for he is the fire of the hearth, the fire of the sacrifice, and the fire of the sun. And there is Varuna, the solemn guardian of the cosmic order, known as Arta. He is a more distant, omniscient deity who watches over the universe. ensuring that the sun rises, the seasons change, and humans adhere to the moral law. To lie or break an oath was to offend Varuna, inviting his stern but just punishment. These were not gods who lived in temples of stone, but who were present in the flash of lightning, the crackle of the sacrificial fire, and the unchanging rhythm of the cosmos. Through the lens of these hymns, the society that created them comes into focus. It is a world of pastoralists and warriors. The prayers are not for urban comforts, but for tangible earthly blessings, for herds of cattle, which were the primary measure of wealth, for swift horses to pull their chariots, for victory over their enemies, and for strong, healthy sons to carry on the family line. Society appears to be organized into tribes, with the Rajan or chieftain leading in battle, though his power was often checked by a tribal council. The two most important classes of people were the Brahmanas, the priests who possessed the sacred knowledge of the hymns and rituals, and the Kshatriyas, the warriors who fought to protect the tribe. The common people, the farmers and herders, were known as the Vish. The hymns also speak frequently of conflicts with the indigenous peoples, the Dasa, portraying them as dark-skinned, snub-nosed people who did not perform the proper sacrifices and were rightly conquered. This gives us a clear, if biased, picture of the tensions and cultural clashes that defined this era of settlement and expansion as the newcomers established their dominance in a new land. That world of the Rigveda, with its open-air fire altars and its prayers for more cows, was not a static one. Over several centuries, from roughly 1000 to 600 BCE, the center of Indo-Aryan culture began a slow but decisive eastward migration. It moved from the land of the seven rivers in the Punjab down into the vast, fertile, and densely forested basin of the river Ganges. This was a profoundly different landscape, wetter and more lush, a land whose thick jungles were not easily cleared for pasture. This geographical shift would act as the catalyst for a complete transformation of their society, moving them from a semi-nomadic life of herding to a settled existence of farming, and from loose-knit tribes to the first stirrings of kingdoms and palaces. The key to unlocking the potential of the Gangetic Plain was iron. While the Rigvedic people were primarily a Bronze Age culture, the inhabitants of this later Vedic period, as it is known, gained access to and mastery of ironworking. Iron axes were far more effective at clearing the dense forests than bronze or stone tools, and iron-tipped plows could break up the heavy, rich soil of the river valley. With this new technology, the Indo-Aryans began a slow but relentless process of deforestation and cultivation. Their focus gradually shifted from their beloved mobile herds of cattle to fixed, permanent fields of wheat, barley, and most importantly, rice. The cultivation of wet rice, in particular, could support a much larger and denser population than pastoralism ever could. This agricultural revolution changed everything. People began to live in permanent villages, and the concept of private ownership of land, which had been vague at best in the tribal era, now became central. With land came the idea of territory. The old tribal assemblies began to lose their influence, and the Rajan, the chieftain you'll remember from the Rigvedic hymns, saw his role evolve dramatically. He was no longer just the most successful warrior who led his people on raids. He became a territorial king, the protector and ruler of a specific realm, or Janapada, which literally means foothold of a tribe. His success was no longer measured just in the cattle he could seize, but in the land he controlled and the surplus grain his people could produce. As the king's power grew, so too did the rituals that legitimized his rule. The simple fire sacrifices of the early days evolved into massive, incredibly complex, and fantastically expensive state ceremonies that could go on for months or even an entire year. The most famous of these was the Ashvamedha, the horse sacrifice. In this grand ritual, a consecrated stallion was set free to wander for a year, followed by the king's warriors. Whichever lands the horse roamed unchallenged were claimed by the king. At the end of the year, the horse was brought back and sacrificed in an elaborate, multi-day ceremony involving hundreds of priests and extravagant offerings. Such a ritual was a monumental display of a king's wealth and power, a piece of political theater designed to awe his subjects and intimidate his rivals. The king was no longer just a chieftain. He was a divinely sanctioned sovereign, his authority cemented by these powerful new Brahmanical rites. This growing complexity in politics and religion was mirrored by a profound change in the structure of society itself. A more settled, populous, and specialized world needed more organization, and this gave rise to a formal system of social hierarchy known as the Varna system. While the seeds of this idea existed in the Rigvedic era, it was in the latter Vedic texts that it was fully articulated, most famously in the hymn of the Purusha Sukta, which describes the creation of humanity from the sacrifice of a cosmic being. From the mouth of this being came the Brahmanas, the priests and scholars who held the sacred knowledge and performed the rituals that maintained cosmic order. From his arms came the Kshatriyas, the warriors and rulers whose duty was to wield power and protect society. From his thighs came the Vaishyas, the farmers, or merchants, and artisans, the economic engine of the kingdom. And from his feet came the Shudras, the laborers and servants, whose role was to serve the other three classes. This fourfold division was, in theory, a model for a perfectly balanced society, with each group performing its essential function. The origins of this system are a deep and complex historical mystery. It likely served, in part, as a way to integrate the diverse populations of the Gangetic Plain, including the indigenous peoples, into a single social structure, often placing them in the lower strata. But whatever its origins, it marked a definitive shift away from the more fluid tribal society of the past. Life was becoming more ordered, more settled, and more secure, but also more rigidly defined. The open pastures were being replaced by fenced-in fields, and the fluid clans were being organized into the fixed hierarchies of a kingdom, setting the stage for an era of even greater political ambition and profound spiritual questioning. The world of the Janapadas, those early territorial kingdoms carved out of the Gangetic forests, was destined for conflict. As these states grew in population, wealth, and ambition, the spaces between them began to shrink. The relative peace of settlement gave way to an age of intense competition. By the dawn of the 6th century BCE, this process of consolidation had given rise to a new and dynamic political landscape, an era dominated by 16 powerful states that stretched across northern India, from the foothills of the Hindu Kush to the plains of Bengal. These were the Mahajanapadas, the great kingdoms, and their emergence marks the beginning of India's classical history and its second great wave of urbanization. This was a world teeming with new cities, bustling with trade, and crackling with political intrigue. Some of these states would become legendary. There was Kashi, with its capital at Varanasi on the sacred banks of the Ganges, already renowned as a center of learning and for its luxurious textiles. To its north lay Kosala, a powerful kingdom that would in later epic tradition be remembered as the realm of the heroic King Rama. In the far northwest, nestled in what is now Pakistan and Afghanistan, was Gandhara, a rugged kingdom that served as a vital crossroads between India and Persia, a conduit for both goods and ideas. Further east, in the heartland of the Gangetic Plain, were the kingdoms of the Vatsas and the Avanti, both formidable military powers. And lurking in the south of Bihar, a state once considered a peripheral backwater, was the kingdom of Magadha, quietly building its strength, destined to play the most decisive role of all. The relationships between these 16 kingdoms were anything but stable. This was an era of constant flux, a centuries-long pan-Indian game of thrones where power was the only currency that mattered. Ambitious kings waged war to expand their territories, control lucrative trade routes, and command the rich agricultural surplus of the plains. They forged strategic alliances, often sealed by marrying their sons and daughters into the royal families of their neighbors, only to break these pacts when a more advantageous opportunity arose. The nature of warfare itself was changing. Remember the small-scale cattle raids of the Rigvedic chieftains? They were replaced by organized campaigns involving infantry, cavalry, and the terrifying new superweapon of the Indian battlefield, the war elephant. The goal was no longer simply plunder, but annexation. Weaker kingdoms were systematically absorbed by their more powerful and ruthless neighbors, their names vanishing from the political map. Yet, in the midst of this relentless rise of monarchy, a fascinating and different political experiment was taking place. Not all of the Mahajanapadas were ruled by a single hereditary king. A number of them, particularly in the lands at the foot of the Himalayas, were Ganasangas, literally, assemblies of the clan. These states, which can be thought of as aristocratic republics or oligarchies, were governed not by one king, but by a council of elders or an assembly composed of the heads of the leading Kshatriya warrior families. The most powerful of these was the Vajjayan Confederacy, a league of 8 allied clans who governed their affairs through a large assembly that met in their capital city of Vaishali. Another famous example was the Shakya clan, who ruled their small republic from Kapilavastu. The inner workings of these ancient republics remain one of the intriguing mysteries of this period. How were decisions made? Did they vote? How was executive power managed? The surviving texts, mostly written from a monarchical point of view, give us only fleeting glimpses. They describe lively debates in assembly halls, where matters of state were discussed and decided collectively by the ruling class. This form of government was a clear alternative to the absolute power of a king, a holdover, perhaps, from the older tribal traditions of the Vedic people. But these republics found themselves at a distinct disadvantage in this new, aggressive political environment. A council, with its debates and factions, could rarely act with the speed and singular purpose of an ambitious king. They were seen by their monarchical neighbors as vulnerable, and one by one, over the next 2 centuries, these fascinating experiments in collective rule would be swallowed by the great imperial kingdoms. This constant churn of warfare, the rise of bustling new cities, and the immense concentration of wealth and power had a disorienting effect on society. The old certainties of the Vedic world, with its focus on precise ritual and placating the gods for worldly gain, began to feel insufficient for many. The rigid social hierarchy of the Varna system, while providing order, also created tension. In the crowded cities, people from all walks of life, merchants as artisans, warriors, and priests, were rubbing shoulders, exchanging new ideas and questioning old traditions. It was a time of immense social stress, but also of incredible intellectual and spiritual ferment. The stage was set for the arrival of new thinkers, radical philosophers who would step outside the Brahmanical tradition to offer entirely new answers to life's oldest and deepest questions. It was into this turbulent, questioning world of burgeoning cities and warring kingdoms that a man was born whose life and teachings would offer a radical way out of the cycle of conflict and suffering. He was not a king in the mold of the ambitious rulers of Magadha or Kosala, nor was he a Brahmin priest dedicated to the ancient fire rituals. He emerged from one of those fascinating republican states we spoke of, the small Ganasangha of the Shakyas, which lay in the foothills of the Himalayas in what is now Nepal. His story, as it has been passed down for centuries, is woven with legend, but it is a legend that points to a profound historical truth about one of humanity's greatest spiritual awakenings. His name was Siddhartha Gautama. The traditions say he was born around 563 BCE. His father, Suddhodana, was the chosen leader of the Shakya Republic, and his mother was the noble queen Maya. The legends tell of a miraculous birth, that he emerged painlessly from his mother's side in a grove of sal trees, and that the infant prince immediately took 7 steps and declared that this would be his final birth. Soon after, a revered sage named Asita came to see the child. Seeing the auspicious marks on the infant's body, the old man smiled, and then he began to weep. He smiled, he explained to the worried father, because the boy was destined for greatness. He would become either a Chakravartin, a universal monarch who would rule the entire world, or he would renounce the world to become a Buddha, a fully enlightened being who would teach humanity the path to liberation. And he wept because he, Asita, was old and would not live long enough to witness it. This prophecy would define Siddhartha's entire youth. His father, a practical man of the world, was horrified at the thought of his son becoming a homeless wanderer. He was determined to ensure that Siddhartha chose the path of the emperor. And so, he constructed for his son a perfect world, a gilded cage designed to insulate him completely from the harsh realities of human existence. Siddhartha was raised in a cocoon of unimaginable luxury with 3 palaces, one for each season. He was surrounded by every conceivable pleasure, exquisite food, beautiful music, fragrant gardens, and charming companions. He was given the finest education, trained in the arts of archery and statecraft, and proved to be a gifted student and athlete. At the age of 16, he was married to his beautiful cousin, Yashodhara, and in time, they had a son named Rahula. By all accounts, he lived a life of idyllic perfection, his every desire fulfilled, his every path smoothed. His father had ensured that he would never see anything that might disturb his mind or turn it towards spiritual matters. The very concepts of sorrow, decay, and death were meticulously hidden from him. But a cage, no matter how gilded, is still a cage. Despite the endless pleasures, a deep and restless questioning began to stir in the prince's heart. He felt a profound sense of unease, a feeling that his perfect life was somehow hollow, a beautiful but fragile illusion. He grew curious about the world that lay beyond his palace walls, the world of ordinary people that he had never been allowed to see. Finally, he persuaded his charioteer, a loyal servant named Chana, to take him on a secret trip into the city. It was on this and subsequent journeys that the walls of his carefully constructed reality came crashing down forever. On his first trip, he saw an old man, his body frail and bent, his skin wrinkled, struggling to walk. Siddhartha, who had never seen extreme age before, was deeply shaken and asked Channa what was wrong with the man. Channa explained that this was old age, a fate that comes to all beings. On a second trip, Siddhartha saw a sick person lying by the side of the road, racked with pain and disease. Again, he was horrified to learn from Channa that sickness is a part of life, that any person's healthy body could be struck down at any time. On a third trip, he saw a funeral procession, and for the first time in his life, he saw a corpse. Channa explained that this was death, the inevitable end that awaits every single person who is born, with no exceptions. The prince was utterly devastated. The knowledge of old age, sickness, and death, the fundamental sufferings of existence, had pierced his heart. His own life of pleasure now seemed like a meaningless charade in the face of this universal truth. He was lost in despair until a fourth trip, when he saw a final transformative sight, a wandering ascetic, a shramana. The man was homeless, with a shaved head and a simple robe, holding only a begging bowl. But his face was filled with a deep and profound sense of peace. In the midst of a world of suffering, this man was serene. In that moment, Siddhartha realized his own path. He understood that to find a solution to the problem of suffering, he too must renounce the world. And so, one night, at the age of 29, he made his decision. He went to the chambers of his wife and son and looked upon them one last time as they slept. Then, turning his back on his kingdom, his power, his family, and his entire life of comfort, he slipped out of the palace and rode off into the darkness of the forest to begin his quest for enlightenment. The prince who walked into the forest was now just another seeker, one of the many homeless wanderers, the shramanas, who crisscrossed the Gangetic plain in search of truth. His quest was singular and urgent, to find a definitive end to the suffering he had witnessed. He began by seeking out the most renowned spiritual teachers of his time, mastering their meditation techniques with astonishing speed. He learned to enter deep states of trance, achieving levels of concentration that his teachers had taken a lifetime to attain. And yet, he found their teachings ultimately unsatisfying. These states were temporary blissful escapes, but they did not eradicate the root causes of suffering. When the meditation ended, the old anxieties and dissatisfactions of the mind would eventually return. He knew this was not the final answer. Leaving these teachers behind, he decided to embark on a different path, one of common practice among the most determined ascetics of the day, the path of extreme self-mortification. He fell in with a group of 5 companions who believed that by conquering the body through extreme discipline, they could liberate the spirit. For 6 years, Siddhartha became the most dedicated of them all. He practiced the most severe austerities imaginable. He held his breath until he felt violent, split pains in his head. He fasted for days and weeks on end, reducing his food intake to a single grain of rice a day, until his body was so emaciated that his ribs could be counted from his back, and his skin clung to his bones like a withered vine. He slept on beds of thorns and exposed himself to the blistering heat of summer and the freezing cold of winter. He pushed his body and his willpower to the absolute limit, believing that this intense, self-inflicted suffering would burn away his impurities and reveal the ultimate truth. But after 6 long years, on the verge of death from starvation, he had a profound realization. This path, too, was a dead end. Torturing his body had not brought him enlightenment. It had only clouded his mind, weakened his intellect, and brought him no closer to understanding the nature of suffering. It was a moment of supreme clarity. He understood that the path to truth could not lie in the extreme of self-indulgence he had known in the palace, nor could it lie in the extreme of self-mortification he had just endured in the forest. The true path, he reasoned, must be a middle way, a path of moderation that avoided both extremes. Remembering a moment of effortless, blissful concentration he had experienced as a child sitting under a tree, he decided to nourish his body so that his mind could be strong. He walked to a nearby river and accepted a humble bowl of rice milk from a village girl named Sujata. Seeing him take food, his 5 ascetic companions were disgusted, believing he had abandoned the spiritual quest and given in to the worldly temptation. They left him in contempt. Now completely alone, Siddhartha felt not despair, but a powerful resolve. With his strength partially restored, he walked to a nearby grove and sat down at the foot of a large peepal tree. He made a solemn vow to the universe: "Let my skin, my sinews, and my bones wither away. Let my flesh and blood dry up. But until I have attained supreme enlightenment, I will not move from this spot." As night fell, he settled into meditation, and the traditions say that his mind was assailed by Mara, the lord of illusion and desire, the embodiment of all the forces that keep beings trapped in the cycle of suffering. Mara tempted him with visions of sensual pleasure, attacked him with armies of demons, and challenged his right to seek enlightenment. In a moment of quiet strength, Siddhartha reached down and touched the ground with his right hand, calling the earth itself to bear witness to his eons of striving and his worthiness to attain this goal. The earth, the stories say, roared its approval, and Mara and his armies vanished like a bad dream. As his mind grew calm and clear in the deep silence of the night, a profound knowledge began to dawn within him. He saw his own past lives stretching back through countless eons. He saw the universal law of karma, how the actions of beings in one life lead to their rebirth in the next. And finally, as the morning star rose in the pre-dawn sky, the last veil of ignorance fell away. He saw with perfect, unshakable clarity the ultimate nature of reality. He understood the cause of suffering, and he understood the way to its complete and utter cessation. In that moment, the quest was over. Siddhartha Gautama was gone, and in his place was the Buddha, the awakened one. After sitting in the bliss of this awakening for weeks, he decided to teach the path he had discovered. He sought out the 5 ascetics who had abandoned him and found them in a deer park at Sarnath, near the city of Varanasi. There he delivered his first sermon, setting in motion the wheel of the Dharma. He did not speak of gods or cosmology, but laid out his discovery in the simple, practical terms of a physician diagnosing an illness. This was the foundation of his teaching, the 4 noble truths. First, that life is inherently characterized by dukkha, suffering, dissatisfaction, and stress. Second, that the cause of this suffering is tanha, craving, clinging, and selfish desire. Third, that it is possible to bring this suffering to a complete end. And fourth, that the way to end it is to follow a clear, practical path, the Noble Eightfold Path, which was the essence of the middle way itself. The Buddha's middle way was a profound and revolutionary answer to the spiritual questions that echoed through the cities and forests of the Mahajanapadas, but it was not the only one. That great ferment of the 6th century BCE, that turning away from the old Vedic rituals, produced many great thinkers and wandering teachers. The Shramana movement was a landscape of diverse philosophies, and among these seekers was another man, a contemporary of the Buddha, whose life story runs in strangely parallel channels, but whose path to liberation would take a radically different turn. He would not advocate for a middle way, but for a path of supreme effort and uncompromising discipline. His name was Vardhamana, but he would become known to the world as Mahavira, the great hero. Like Siddhartha, Mahavira was born a prince of the Kshatriya warrior class, not in a great monarchy, but in one of the republican Ganasangas, in his case, as a leading member of the Vajjayan Confederacy, that powerful state we saw vying for power. His upbringing, too, was one of princely comfort and luxury. He was educated in the arts and sciences, married a noble lady, and had a daughter. He lived the life of a householder, fulfilling his duties to his family and his clan. But like Siddhartha, he felt a deep spiritual calling that the pleasures of the world could not satisfy. He felt the profound weight of the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, a cycle driven by the consequences of one's actions. After the death of his parents, at the age of 30, with the permission of his family, he too performed his own great renunciation, giving away his wealth, leaving his home, and becoming a homeless, wandering monk in search of the ultimate truth. It is here that his path diverges sharply from the Buddha's. Remember how Siddhartha practiced extreme asceticism for 6 years and then rejected it as a dead end? For Mahavira, that very same path of intense self-mortification was not an obstacle, but the essential and only means to salvation. For the next 12.5 years, Mahavira wandered through the towns and villages of northern India, subjecting himself to the most extreme forms of hardship imaginable. He practiced long and severe fasts, sometimes going for months with no food. He meditated for hours in the scorching sun of summer and in the cold of winter. He abandoned all comforts, even clothing, and walked the earth naked, exposed to the elements. He silently endured the abuse and attacks of people who did not understand his path and allowed insects to crawl and bait his body without brushing them away. This was not self-punishment for its own sake. It was rooted in a very specific worldview. For Jains, karma is not an abstract law of cause and effect, but a subtle, physical substance, like a fine dust that clings to the soul, which they call the jiva. Every action, and even every thought, every word, causes this karmic matter to stick to the soul, weighing it down, obscuring its natural state of pure bliss and omniscience, and trapping it in the endless cycle of rebirth. The purpose of Mahavira's intense asceticism was twofold. First, to burn away all the old karma that had accumulated over countless past lives, and second, to stop the influx of any new karma. By patiently and mindfully enduring hardship without complaint, he was cleansing his soul, purifying it, atom by atom, until it could finally break free. After 12.5 years of this incredible effort, while meditating in a field, he finally achieved his goal. He attained Kevala Jnana, a state of supreme omniscient knowledge. He had become a Jina, a conqueror, from which the name Jainism is derived. For the next 30 years, he taught the path he had rediscovered, the absolute bedrock of his teaching. Its highest virtue and guiding principle is ahimsa, or nonviolence. But this was nonviolence of a kind and a scope that the world had never seen. For Mahavira, the soul, the jiva, was not just present in humans and animals. It was present in all living things, including the smallest insects, the trees and plants, and even in what we would consider inanimate elements, like water, earth, fire, and air. To harm any of these, even accidentally, was to injure a living soul and attract negative karma. This is why devout Jain monks to this day may wear masks over their mouths to avoid inhaling and killing airborne microorganisms, and sweep the path before them with a soft broom to gently clear away any insects they might otherwise step on. It is a path of profound and radical compassion for all existence. He also taught the principles of aparigraha, or non-possessiveness, the renunciation of all attachments to people, places, and things, which are the root of greed and violence, and an akantavada, or non-absolutism, the idea that ultimate truth and reality are complex and have multiple aspects, and that one should remain open to different viewpoints. Interestingly, Mahavira was not considered the founder of a new religion. Instead, he was seen as the 24th and final Tirthankara, or Ford maker, of this cosmic age, one in a long line of enlightened beings who appear in the world to teach the eternal Dharma. His immediate predecessor, Parshvanatha, is now accepted as a historical figure who lived some 250 years earlier, lending a concrete historical anchor to this ancient lineage. Mahavira was the great hero who revitalized this timeless path, an austere and deeply compassionate way to conquer the self and win eternal freedom. While the Buddha was gathering his first followers in the deer park, and Mahavira was embarking on his silent, austere wanderings, the great political drama of the Mahajanapadas was accelerating towards its climax. These two great spiritual paths were not born in a vacuum, but in a land of intense political competition, and much of their teaching took place within the borders of the very kingdom that was beginning to master this competition with unparalleled ambition and skill. Remember that crowded chessboard of 16 kingdoms, all vying for power? As the 6th century BCE unfolded, one of those kingdoms, once considered something of an upstart on the eastern fringe of the Aryan world, began to systematically outmaneuver and dominate all the others. This was the kingdom of Magadha. Magadha's rise was no accident. It was a success story built on a foundation of unique strategic advantages. Its first capital, a city called Rajagriha, was a natural fortress nestled within a protective ring of 5 steep hills. The land itself was immensely fertile, perfectly suited for the wet rice cultivation that could sustain large armies and a growing population. More importantly, the hills to the south of Magadha were rich with deposits of iron ore, giving its rulers access to the raw materials for superior weapons and tools. Its forests provided a seemingly endless supply of timber and, crucially, a steady stream of war elephants, the ancient world's equivalent of battle tanks. Positioned astride the lower Ganges, Magadha controlled the riverine trade routes, effectively acting as a gatekeeper for the flow of goods across northern India. It was a kingdom blessed with everything a budding empire could ever need: natural defenses, agricultural wealth, mineral resources, and a commanding strategic position. But resources alone do not build an empire. The true architect of Magadha's ascent was its king, a shrewd and pragmatic ruler of the Haryanka dynasty named Bimbisara, who came to the throne around 544 BCE. Bimbisara was a master of the three-dimensional chess of statecraft, perfectly balancing diplomacy, conquest, and administration. He understood that not every enemy needed to be fought. He secured his most dangerous borders through a series of brilliant marriage alliances. By marrying a princess from the powerful kingdom of Kosala to his west, he not only neutralized a major threat, but also received the territory of Kashi with its rich tax revenues as her dowry. He also married princesses from other powerful clans, including the Videhas and the Lishchavis of the Vajjian Confederacy, turning potential adversaries into peaceful in-laws. With his western flank secure, he turned his military might eastward, conquering the neighboring kingdom of Anga. This was a crucial victory, for it gave Magadha direct control over the trade routes that flowed down the Ganges to the ports on the Bay of Bengal, opening up a lucrative channel for maritime commerce. But perhaps Bimbisara's most lasting contribution was his skill in administration. He was the first Indian king to create a truly organized, standing bureaucracy with a hierarchy of officers appointed to oversee everything from justice to tax collection to public works. He understood that a powerful state needed more than just a strong army. It needed an efficient system to harness the wealth of the land. It is a testament to the vibrant intellectual climate of his kingdom that Bimbisara was a great admirer and patron of both the Buddha and Mahavira, often seeking out their counsel. Bimbisara's long and successful reign, however, came to a dark and tragic end, at least according to the Buddhist and Jain scriptures. His son, Ajatashatru, was a man of far greater impatience and seemingly far less conscience. The traditional accounts paint him as a ruthless figure who grew tired of waiting for power and, encouraged by rival cousins of the Buddha, had his own father, Bimbisara, thrown into prison. There, the old king, the architect of Magadha's greatness, was left to starve to death. While this story of patricide might be an exaggeration designed by religious chroniclers to highlight Ajatashatru's tyrannical nature, his rule was certainly defined by a new level of aggression. Where his father had used marriage to create peace with Kosala, Ajatashatru went to war with them, breaking the old alliance in a long and costly conflict, which he eventually won. His most famous military campaign was a 16-year war of attrition against the Vajjian Confederacy, his own mother's people. The Republic, with its council of clans, proved a difficult enemy to defeat on the battlefield. So Ajatashatru resorted to subterfuge, sending a Brahmin minister into their capital to sow discord and suspicion among the clans. After years of this patient deception, when the Confederacy was weakened from within, Ajatashatru unleashed his army, employing new and terrifying siege engines, including a mechanized catapult that hurled massive stones in a chariot with whirling blades. He crushed the last great republic of northern India, absorbing its territory into his ever-expanding kingdom. Under Bimbisara, Magadha had become a great power. Under Ajatashatru, it became an unstoppable force, the undisputed hegemon of the Gangetic Plain, a kingdom whose growing shadow was now poised to become an empire. As the shadow of Magadha fell across the Gangetic Plain, consolidating the heartland of India into a single, formidable power, an entirely different storm was gathering far to the west. For centuries, the northwestern part of the subcontinent, the old Mahajanapada of Gandhara and its neighbors, had existed in the orbit of another great empire, the Achaemenid Empire of Persia. But in the 330s BCE, that mighty Persian state was shattered and conquered by a brilliant and impossibly ambitious young king from the small Greek kingdom of Macedon. His name was Alexander, and he believed it was his destiny to conquer the entire known world. Having subdued Persia, his gaze naturally turned to its easternmost territories, and beyond them, to the legendary and fabulously wealthy lands of India. Two worlds, which had known of each other only through the whispers of traders and the haze of myth, were about to collide with the force of a thunderclap. In 327 BCE, Alexander the Great led his invincible, battle-hardened army of Macedonians and Greeks across the snow-capped peaks of the Hindu Kush and descended into the plains of the Punjab. The India he entered was not the unified state that Magadha was building in the east. The northwest was a fractured mosaic of smaller kingdoms and fiercely independent tribal republics, a land of intense rivalries and shifting allegiances. This political disunity played directly into Alexander's hands. Some local rulers, like Ambi, the king of Taxila, saw an opportunity. Instead of fighting the seemingly unstoppable invader, Ambi chose to welcome him, lavishing Alexander with gifts, replenishing his supplies, and becoming a valuable ally. Alexander's army marched into Taxila, one of the great intellectual centers of ancient India, and the Greeks were mesmerized. Here, in this bustling university city, these men of the West encountered the mystics and philosophers of the East, the naked ascetics they called gymnosophists, whose wisdom and indifference to material wealth both fascinated and baffled them. But not all the Indian kings were willing to bow. Beyond the city of Taxila, across the formidable monsoon-swollen river Jhelum, which the Greeks called the Hydaspes, lay the kingdom of a proud and powerful ruler named Porus, or Puru. Porus refused Alexander's demand to submit and massed his army on the far bank of the river, determined to defend his homeland. His army was a terrifying sight, anchored by a line of 200 war elephants, a weapon the Macedonians had never faced in such numbers. The battle that followed would become one of Alexander's most legendary and most difficult victories. Faced with a seemingly impassable river and a powerful enemy, Alexander displayed the tactical genius that had made him undefeated. He left a portion of his army in the main camp to distract Porus, while he marched his main force upstream under the cover of a stormy night and executed a daring surprise crossing at a different point. The clash, when it came, was one of terrifying ferocity. The Macedonian cavalry, led by Alexander himself, crashed into the Indian flanks, while his infantry, the disciplined pikemen of the phalanx, advanced on the center. The battle raged for hours in the mud and rain. The war elephants, at first, caused chaos in the Macedonian ranks, their trumpeting cries and unstoppable charges breaking through the lines. But the Macedonians adapted, targeting the elephants' drivers, the mahots, and wounding the great beasts with their long pikes, until the maddened, pain-crazed animals turned and trampled their own infantry. In the end, Greek discipline and Alexander's brilliant cavalry tactics won the day. The Indian army was shattered, and Porus, fighting valiantly to the very end from atop his led elephant, was wounded and captured. The meeting between the two kings after the battle has echoed through history. The tall, dignified Porus was brought before Alexander, who, impressed by the bearing of the man who had almost defeated him, asked how he wished to be treated. Porus's reply was simple and fearless, as a king. This magnificent display of courage won Alexander's complete admiration. He not only gave Porus his kingdom back, but also added new territories to his domain, turning a defeated foe into a loyal and powerful vassal. It was a moment of profound mutual respect, a brief, luminous encounter between two different worlds. Alexander, ever restless, wanted to push on. He had heard tales of the great river Ganges and of the unimaginably vast and wealthy kingdom that lay upon its banks, the empire of Magadha, now ruled by the Nanda dynasty. He dreamed of conquering all of it. But his army, which had followed him for 8 years and 10,000 miles, had finally reached its limit. The soldiers were exhausted, homesick, and terrified by the stories of the Nanda Empire, which was said to command armies of hundreds of thousands of infantry and thousands of war elephants, a force that would dwarf even the army of Porus. At the river Hyphasis, the modern Beas, his veteran troops mutinied. They laid down their arms and refused to go one step further. A furious and heartbroken Alexander was forced to concede. The great eastward conquest was over. He turned his army around and began the long, arduous journey back to the west, leaving India as suddenly as he had arrived, a brilliant but fleeting meteor that had streaked across the Indian sky. Alexander's retreat from India left behind more than just a handful of Greek garrisons and a few new cities named after himself and his horse. His invasion had acted like a political earthquake in the northwest, shattering the old Mahajanapadas of the Punjab and leaving a chaotic power vacuum in its wake. Meanwhile, in the east, the empire of Magadha, under the rule of the widely disliked Nanda dynasty, remained as powerful and feared as ever. The Nanda king Adluhanananda, who had commanded the vast armies that so terrified Alexander's soldiers, ruled with an iron fist, his treasury overflowing from exorbitant taxes. The political stage was perfectly set, a destabilized frontier in the west and an oppressive yet mighty empire in the east. It was a moment crying out for a new leader, someone with the vision and audacity to exploit the chaos and challenge the seemingly unshakable power of the Nandas. That leader was a young man of mysterious origins named Chandragupta Maurya. The true beginnings of Chandragupta are shrouded in the mists of legend. The historical records are sparse and often contradictory. Some ancient texts claim he was a member of the Kshatriya warrior class from a clan of peacock tamers, the Mauryas. Others, more critical, suggest he came from a much humbler background, perhaps even from the Shudra class. This very obscurity may have been part of his power, a man who seemed to come from nowhere to claim everything. But one thing all the stories agree on is that his meteoric rise was not his doing alone. At his side, as his mentor, strategist, and prime minister, was one of the most formidable intellects in Indian history, a shrewd and famously ruthless Brahmin named Chanakya. The story of their meeting is the stuff of legend, a foundational myth for the empire they would build together. Chanakya, a brilliant but proud scholar, had traveled to the court of Dhanananda in the capital city of Pataliputra. There, feeling that he was not shown the respect he deserved, he was publicly insulted by the arrogant king. A furious Chanakya, his pride deeply wounded, swore a solemn and terrible oath in front of the entire court. He would not tie up his scholar's topknot of hair until he had utterly destroyed the Nanda dynasty, root and branch. He stormed out of the palace and began to wander the country, searching for a worthy individual to be the instrument of his elaborate revenge. He eventually found him in the young Chandragupta. Seeing the boy playing at being a king with his friends, Chanakya recognized in him a natural charisma and a spark of royal authority. He took Chandragupta under his wing, educated him in the arts of war and statecraft at the great university of Taxila, and began to groom him for the throne. Their strategy was as brilliant as it was patient. Instead of launching a suicidal direct assault on the Nanda heartland in Magadha, Chanakya guided Chandragupta to the northwest. This was the region still reeling from Alexander's invasion, a land of political turmoil. It was the perfect place to start a rebellion. Raising an army of mercenaries and local clans who were resentful of foreign rule, Chandragupta began his campaign by first attacking the Greek garrisons that Alexander had left behind. He systematically dismantled the remnants of Greek power, liberating the territories of the Punjab, and in the process, forging his rebel force into a disciplined and loyal army. He was not just a warlord, he was a unifier, harnessing the resources and the martial spirit of the Northwest and consolidating a powerful kingdom for himself on the very frontiers of the Nanda Empire. With his western flank secure and a powerful army at his command, Chandragupta was finally ready to fulfill Chanakya's oath. He turned his forces eastward and marched on Magadha. The Nanda dynasty, for all its wealth and military might, was deeply unpopular with its own people. Dhanananda was seen as greedy, arrogant, and tyrannical. The population was ripe for a change. The details of the war are lost to history, but the result was decisive. In a great and bloody conflict, Chandragupta's army defeated the Nanda forces and stormed the capital city of Pataliputra. Dhanananda was overthrown and killed, and Chanakya's long-nurtured plan for revenge was complete. Around the year 321 BCE, Chandragupta Maurya ascended the throne of Magadha, but he was not merely the king of another dynasty. By uniting the martial lands of the Punjab with the imperial heartland of the Gangetic Plain, he had created something new. The age of the Mahajanapadas was definitively over. The age of the first great Indian empire, the Mauryan Empire, had begun. Having won the throne of Magadha, Chandragupta and his mentor Chanakya faced a challenge far greater than any single battle: how to govern the vast, diverse, and fractious territories they now controlled. Conquering an empire is a matter of military force, but holding it together requires something else entirely: a system. And the system they created was one of the most sophisticated, centralized, and chillingly efficient administrative machines the ancient world had ever seen. To understand the Mauryan state is to look under the hood of their empire and see the intricate clockwork of power, an all-seeing and all-encompassing apparatus of control designed by a master of political pragmatism. Our primary guide to this world is an extraordinary and unique document, a detailed treatise on statecraft called the Arthashastra, or the Science of Material Gain. Tradition attributes this work to Chanakya himself, and while scholars debate whether it was the work of a single genius or a compilation of political thought from that era, there is no doubt that it perfectly captures the ruthless and calculating spirit of Mauryan policy. The Arthashastra is not a book of gentle philosophy or moral ideals. It is a cold-blooded, unsentimental instruction manual for any ruler who wishes to acquire, and more importantly, hold on to power. It is relentlessly practical, covering everything from the management of agriculture and the collection of taxes to the conduct of diplomacy, the waging of war, and most famously, the organization of a vast and pervasive network of spies. It operates on a simple, stark principle: the security and prosperity of the state are the ultimate goals, and virtually any means used to achieve them are justified. Following this blueprint, the Mauryan Empire was organized like a great pyramid. At the apex was the emperor in his capital at Pataliputra, an absolute monarch with final authority over all matters. The empire was divided into a handful of large provinces, often governed by royal princes, which were then subdivided into smaller districts and finally down to the local level of the village. At every level, a vast and complex bureaucracy of officials, ministers, and superintendents carried out the will of the central government. There was a superintendent for everything imaginable, each tasked with regulating and taxing a specific sphere of life. The superintendent of commerce set prices, monitored weights and measures, and collected customs duties on the goods that flowed through the empire's bustling cities. The superintendent of mines controlled the state's monopoly on precious metals and iron. The superintendent of forests managed timber resources and the capture of wild elephants for the army. The superintendent of liquor regulated taverns, and the superintendent of prostitutes managed and taxed their trade. This was not a system of free enterprise. It was a highly centralized, state-controlled economy designed to extract the maximum possible revenue from the land and its people to fund the empire's two greatest expenses, its enormous army and its equally enormous bureaucracy. The land tax was the backbone of the state, but everything, it seems, was taxed, from the ferryman who took you across the river to the artisan who sold you a pot. It was a remarkably thorough and modern-seeming system, a state that sought to manage and account for every aspect of its economic life, all recorded by an army of scribes and clerks. But the most famous and, to a modern mind, the most unsettling aspect of this Mauryan state was its pervasive system of espionage. The Arthashastra lays out, in meticulous detail, the necessity for the king to have eyes and ears everywhere. Chanakya envisioned a web of spies and informants that would permeate every level of society. These agents, there were not just a few shadowy figures, they were a vast network drawn from all walks of life. There were spies disguised as holy ascetics who could wander freely and command respect. There were merchant spies who could report on economic conditions and foreign affairs. There were spies among the farmers in the villages and the artisans in the cities. The state also employed poisoners, assassins, and seductive courtesans to gather intelligence or eliminate troublesome officials or rival princes. This network had multiple functions. Its primary purpose was internal security, to monitor the emperor's own ministers, generals, and even his sons for any hint of disloyalty or corruption. The Arthashastra operates on the assumption that everyone is a potential threat. Spies were also used to gauge public opinion, to listen to the gossip in the marketplace, and learn what the common people were saying about the king and his policies. And in foreign affairs, they were an essential tool sent into neighboring kingdoms to sow discord, spread propaganda and disinformation, and assess their military strengths and weaknesses before an invasion. It was a paranoid vision of governance, an all-seeing state where trust was a liability, and the emperor's silent, watchful presence was felt in every village and every household, holding the vast and fragile empire together through a mixture of efficient administration and quiet, ever-present fear. This powerful but unforgiving state machine, built on a foundation of pragmatism and fear, was passed down from Chandragupta to his son, Bindusara, who maintained and consolidated the empire. And from Bindusara, the throne passed to his son, a man who would become the most famous of all the Mauryan emperors, and indeed one of the most remarkable rulers in all of world history. His name was Ashoka. In his youth, Ashoka was the perfect product of the system Chanakya had envisioned. He was a brilliant and ambitious general, serving as a viceroy in the provinces, where he proved ruthlessly effective at crushing rebellions. The legends surrounding his accession to the throne around 268 BCE are dark and bloody. They claim that he was not his father's chosen heir and had to fight a brutal succession war against his own brothers, supposedly killing 99 of them to secure his power. Because of this, he earned the chilling moniker Chandashoka, or Ashoka the Fierce. For the first 8 years of his reign, he ruled just as his grandfather had, as a conqueror and a stern autocrat, expanding the empire and strengthening the state's already formidable grip on its people. There was one last major region on the subcontinent that had yet to fall under Mauryan control. This was the kingdom of Kalinga on the east coast of India, corresponding to the modern state of Odisha. Kalinga was a prosperous land, enriched by maritime trade and defiant of Mauryan supremacy. For an emperor like Ashoka, obsessed with completing the unification of India, its continued independence was an intolerable challenge. And so, in the 8th year of his reign, around 262 BCE, Ashoka unleashed the full, terrifying might of the Mauryan military on the people of Kalinga. The war was not a protracted struggle. It was a brutal, overwhelming display of force. The Mauryan army, with its vast infantry and its terrifying elephant corps, crushed the Kalingan resistance. But it is the aftermath of the battle that changed the course of history. Ashoka, as was the custom for a victorious king, toured the conquered territory to survey his triumph. But what he saw there did not fill him with pride. It filled him with a profound and sickening horror. In his own words, which he would later have carved into stone for all to see, he described the scene. 150,000 people had been deported from their homes. 100,000 had been slain in the fighting, and many times that number had perished from the famine and disease that followed in the war's wake. He saw the ruined villages and the smoldering fields. He heard the cries of the women and children who had lost their husbands and fathers. He saw the Brahmins and the holy men who had been killed or driven from their homes. For the first time, this fierce and ruthless emperor was forced to confront the true human cost of his own ambition. The sheer scale of the suffering that he personally had inflicted broke him. He was overcome, as he later wrote, by profound sorrow and regret. This immense crisis of conscience became the pivotal turning point of his life. The triumphant conqueror was now a man racked with remorse, questioning the very foundations of his power. He began to seek out new answers, a different way to rule, a different way to live. He found it in the gentle teachings of the Buddha, which, remember, had been quietly spreading through India for over 2 centuries. The Buddha's message of nonviolence, compassion, and mindfulness resonated deeply with the emperor's newfound horror of war. He began to study the Dharma, and slowly a profound transformation took place. This is, of course, the traditional story, and it is a powerful one. The historical reality might have been more complex. Perhaps Ashoka's conversion was a more gradual process, a slow evolution of his personal beliefs that was dramatically crystallized by the events in Kalinga. Perhaps it was also a shrewd political move, a way to unify his vast and diverse empire, not just with force, but with a shared, compassionate ideology. But whether it was a sudden spiritual revolution or a gradual change of heart, the result was the same. Ashoka, the fierce conqueror, renounced aggressive warfare as an instrument of state policy. He declared that the only true conquest was not Digvijaya, conquest by the sword, but Dhammavijaya, conquest by righteousness and moral principle. He transformed himself from Chandashoka, Ashoka the Fierce, into Devanampiya Piyadasi, the beloved of the gods, he who looks upon all with affection, the name by which he refers to himself in his famous edicts. This was not just a private change of heart, it was a complete reversal of Mauryan state policy. The royal hunts, a favorite pastime of his predecessors, were abolished. He embraced vegetarianism and discouraged the ritual slaughter of animals. The vast resources of the empire were now redirected away from military campaigns and towards public works, building hospitals for both humans and animals, digging wells, planting shade trees along the roads for the comfort of travelers, and establishing stupas and monasteries. It was one of the most astonishing transformations in history. A victorious emperor at the absolute zenith of his power, who looked upon the fruits of his victory and instead of celebrating, chose the path of peace. Ashoka's profound change of heart was not something he kept to himself. A personal conversion, however sincere, would mean little if it did not fundamentally change the way his vast empire was governed. Having renounced the path of the sword, the beloved of the gods now faced a new and unprecedented challenge: how to unify a continent-sized territory, home to countless different ethnic groups, languages, and belief systems, using only the power of a moral idea. His solution was one of the most remarkable public communication campaigns in history. He decided to speak directly to his people, to explain his new philosophy, and to persuade them to live by its principles. And to ensure his message would endure, he had it carved not on perishable palm leaves, but directly into the living rock of the subcontinent itself. Across the length and breadth of the Mauryan Empire, from the rugged hills of Afghanistan in the west to the plains of Bengal in the east, and as far south as Karnataka, a series of extraordinary monuments began to appear. These are Ashoka's famous edicts. They were inscribed on massive, freestanding pillars of polished sandstone and on the faces of great natural boulders. The pillars, in particular, were marvels of Mauryan engineering and art, quarried and transported hundreds of miles, buffed to a mirror-like sheen, and topped with magnificent animal sculptures, most famously the capital of 4 lions standing back to back, which is now the national emblem of modern India. These edicts were placed in busy towns, on major trade routes, and at important pilgrimage sites, places where the maximum number of people would see them. And crucially, they were not written in the high Sanskrit of the priestly elite. Ashoka had them inscribed in the various local languages and scripts of his people, ensuring that his message was accessible not just to scholars, but to the common man and woman. They were, in effect, the world's first imperial billboards, public proclamations from a king who now wished to be seen not as a remote, all-powerful conqueror, but as a compassionate fatherly guide to his subjects. The core message of these stone sermons was Ashoka's new philosophy of Dhamma. This is a complex word, and its meaning is the key to understanding Ashoka's reign. While the emperor was now a devout Buddhist, the Dhamma he promoted in his edicts was not a narrow sectarian doctrine. He wasn't trying to force everyone to become a Buddhist. Instead, his Dhamma was a universal code of ethics, a set of moral principles that he believed could be embraced by people of all faiths to create a more just, tolerant, and harmonious society. The edicts returned to the core tenets of this Dhamma again and again. At its heart was ahimsa, non-injury to all living beings, which led him to restrict animal sacrifice and promote vegetarianism. Another key pillar was tolerance. In one of his most famous edicts, Ashoka declares that he honors all religious sects and that no one should praise their own religion while condemning another's. He encouraged respectful dialogue between different faiths, a revolutionary idea in an age of dogma. His Dhamma was also a doctrine of social responsibility. It called for obedience to parents, generosity towards friends and relatives, and most importantly, the humane and considerate treatment of servants and slaves. It was a moral code that emphasized self-control, urging people to avoid anger, cruelty, vanity, and pride. It was, in essence, an attempt to build a society based on compassion rather than coercion. The old Mauryan state, remember, was a machine built on espionage and fear. Ashoka sought to replace that fear with a shared sense of moral duty, to rule not by the iron fist of the Arthashastra, but by appealing to the better nature of his people. To put this vision into practice, Ashoka didn't just rely on stone inscriptions. He created an entirely new class of royal officials known as the Mahajanapadas, or the officers of righteousness. These were special ministers whose job was to travel throughout the empire, not to collect taxes or enforce laws, but to promote and explain the Dhamma. They were tasked with ensuring the welfare of the people, protecting the vulnerable from exploitation, and even overseeing the proper treatment of prisoners. It was a moral police force, tasked with spreading the emperor's new vision of a compassionate state. But Ashoka's ambition did not stop at the borders of his empire. Believing he had found a universal truth, he felt a duty to share it with the entire world. In what was perhaps his most consequential act, he began to send Buddhist missions to foreign lands. He sent his own son, Mahinda, and his daughter, Sangamita, to the island of Sri Lanka, where they successfully converted the king and established a thriving Buddhist community that endures to this day. He also sent emissaries of the Dhamma West to the great Hellenistic kingdoms ruled by the successors of Alexander the Great, to Egypt, Syria, Macedon, and Greece. The emperor who had once conquered with his armies now sought a gentle, quiet conquest of the heart, sending monks and missionaries to carry a message of peace to the far corners of the known world. For nearly 4 decades, Ashoka ruled over his vast and peaceful empire, a realm united not by the sword, but by the gentle persuasion of his Dhamma, its principles etched in stone. His reign was the high summer of the Mauryan age, a period of unparalleled stability and moral purpose. But empires, no matter how mighty, are subject to the same laws of impermanence as all other things. Ashoka's vision was held together by the force of his own remarkable personality, and after his death in 232 BCE, the great edifice that he and his forefathers had built began, slowly at first, and then with gathering speed, to crumble. The long, golden autumn of the Mauryas had begun, and it would end in a winter of fragmentation. The reasons for the decline of this first great Indian empire are a subject of quiet and endless debate among historians. There was no single dramatic cause, but rather a slow unraveling, a combination of pressures that the once mighty state could no longer withstand. And ironically, some of the seeds of this decline may have been planted by Ashoka himself, the empire's greatest ruler. His policy of ahimsa and his public renunciation of aggressive warfare, while morally admirable, may have had unintended consequences. The Mauryan military, which had been the terror of the subcontinent under Chandragupta and the young Ashoka, was now discouraged from the very activity that had forged and defined it. With no wars to fight, its morale and battle readiness may have begun to atrophy. The empire's frontiers, once fiercely guarded, were now seen as less threatening, potentially emboldening ambitious provincial governors and foreign powers who sensed a weakening of the imperial will. Furthermore, Ashoka's patronage of Buddhism and his ethical Dhamma with its prohibitions on animal sacrifice, may have created a silent but deep-seated resentment within the powerful Brahmanical priestly class. For centuries, the Brahmins had been the traditional spiritual authorities, their status and livelihood dependent on the performance of the very Vedic rituals that Ashoka's policies now discouraged. While Ashoka preached tolerance, his personal preference and imperial favor clearly lay with the new Buddhist faith. This may have alienated a powerful and influential segment of society, creating a source of internal opposition that was waiting for the moment when the center's power began to fade. Another significant pressure was economic. While Ashoka had stopped spending the empire's wealth on costly military campaigns, he had redirected it towards other, equally expensive projects. Remember that vast Mauryan bureaucracy? It not only continued, but Ashoka added to it with his new class of Dhamma officers. His extensive public works, the building of thousands of stupas, monasteries, hospitals, and rest houses for travelers, while profoundly beneficial for the people, placed an immense strain on the imperial treasury. The Mauryan economic machine was a system designed to fund a military expansionist state. When the expansion stopped, the state's income from new conquests and plunder ceased, but its expenses continued to mount. In the later years of Mauryan rule, there is evidence of financial strain, such as the debasement of coinage, a classic sign that a government is struggling to meet its obligations. But perhaps the most decisive factor was the most common of all imperial ailments, the problem of succession. Ashoka was a leader of extraordinary vision and authority. His successors were not. After his death, the historical records become hazy, but they suggest a series of weaker rulers and a possible division of the empire among his sons and grandsons. None of them possessed Ashoka's charisma or his administrative genius. Without a strong hand at the tiller in the capital city of Pataliputra, the centrifugal forces that are always present in a large empire began to pull it apart. Distant provincial governors, who ruled vast territories as viceroys, began to see themselves as independent kings. The South broke away, then other regions began to assert their autonomy. The empire was simply too vast, its peoples too diverse, to be held together by a weak central authority. The end, when it came, was not a grand fiery collapse, but a quiet and ignominious betrayal. For 50 years after Ashoka's death, his descendants presided over a steadily shrinking realm. The final Mauryan emperor, a man named Brihadratha, ruled over a kingdom that was little more than a shadow of its former glory, centered once again on the original heartland of Magadha. Then, around 185 BCE, during a grand review of his army, the emperor was assassinated in full view of his troops. The killer was his own commander-in-chief, a Brahmin general named Pushyamitra Shunga. With this swift and public coup d'etat, the great Mauryan dynasty, which had unified India, battled the successor of Alexander the Great, and produced one of history's most enlightened rulers, was extinguished. The age of imperial unity was over, and India was once again a fractured land of competing kingdoms. The fall of the Mauryan dynasty was like the collapse of a great dam. For a century and a half, its immense power had held the subcontinent in a state of unified stability, keeping the ambitions of its neighbors and the pressures of the wider world at bay. When that dam broke, The political landscape was once again inundated by the forces of fragmentation. The new Shunga dynasty, founded by the general who had assassinated the last Mauryan emperor, was a shadow of its predecessor, its authority largely confined to the old imperial heartland of Magadha. In the south and the Deccan, local kingdoms reasserted their independence. But the most dramatic changes occurred in the northwest, on the great frontier where India met Central Asia and the Hellenistic world. The power vacuum left by the Mauryans created an irresistible pull, and a series of new peoples began to pour through the mountain passes, bringing with them new languages, new art forms, and new ideas, turning northern India into a vibrant and dynamic crucible of cultures. The first to arrive were the Greeks. Remember that Alexander the Great's invasion was a brief affair, but it had left a lasting legacy just beyond the Hindu Kush, in the land of Bactria, what is now northern Afghanistan. There, a powerful and prosperous Hellenistic kingdom had flourished, ruled by the descendants of Alexander's generals. For decades, they had watched the Mauryan Empire with a mixture of awe and respect. But now, with the empire crumbling, the Greco-Bactrian kings saw their moment. Around 180 BCE, their king, Demetrius, led his armies back over the mountains, retracing Alexander's path and conquering large swathes of what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. This was the beginning of the Indo-Greek kingdoms, a unique and fascinating chapter in which Greek and Indian civilizations would meet and merge. For nearly 2 centuries, a series of some 30 Greek kings ruled over parts of northern India. They established new capitals and brought with them the hallmarks of their Hellenistic culture, their language, their gods, and their artistic styles. But they did not remain isolated conquerors. They quickly began to adapt to their new Indian environment. The most beautiful evidence of this fusion is their coinage. On one side of a coin, you might find a stunningly realistic portrait of the Greek king, a masterpiece of Hellenistic art. But on the other side, you might find an image of an Indian deity, or a Buddhist symbol like the wheel of the Dharma, with the king's name and titles inscribed not only in Greek, but also in the local Indian scripts of Brahmi and Kharosthi. These small objects are potent symbols of a world where 2 great cultures were not just coexisting, but were actively engaging with and borrowing from one another. The greatest of these Indo-Greek kings was Menander, known in Indian sources as Milinda, who ruled in the 2nd century BCE. He was a powerful conqueror who pushed his kingdom's borders far into the Gangetic Plain, but he is best remembered not for his battles, but for his engagement with Indian philosophy. A famous Buddhist text, the Milinda Panha, or the Questions of King Milinda, records a series of brilliant and searching dialogues between the Greek king and a Buddhist sage named Nagasena. In the text, the curious and skeptical king questions the sage on the core tenets of Buddhism, particularly the difficult concept of no self, the idea that there is no permanent, unchanging soul. Nagasena, with great patience and wit, explains the doctrine using the famous analogy of a chariot. He asks the king if the chariot is the wheels, the axle, the frame, or the reins. The king agrees that it is none of these things individually. The chariot, Nagasena explains, is merely a convenient name, a label we give to the collection of parts when they are assembled in a certain way. So it is with a person. We are a temporary collection of physical and mental components, and the self is just a label, not a permanent entity. According to the text, King Menander was so convinced by the sage's wisdom that he became a devout Buddhist, a powerful symbol of the intellectual fusion of this era. The Indo-Greeks, however, were not the last to arrive. Great movements of nomadic peoples on the steppes of Central Asia created a domino effect. Pushed from their homelands, a group known as the Shakas, or Scythians, swept down into Bactria and then into India, overrunning the Indo-Greek kingdoms in the 1st century BCE. They were followed in turn by the Pallavas, or Parthians. Like the Greeks before them, these new groups of rulers did not simply destroy and replace. They too adopted Indian religions, used Indian languages on their coins, and became patrons of Indian art, adding new Central Asian flavors to the already cosmopolitan mix of the Northwest. The political map was a chaotic patchwork of competing kingdoms, but beneath the surface of this chaos, a rich and creative cultural synthesis was taking place, laying the foundations for the next great empire of the subcontinent. Out of the dynamic but politically chaotic world of Indo-Greeks, Shakas, and Parthians, a new and even more formidable power began to coalesce. While these various groups fought for control of the cities and trade routes of northern India, another nomadic people who had been patiently consolidating their strength in the lands of Bactria and Central Asia were preparing to sweep down and impose a new unity on the region. They were not just another wave of invaders, they were empire builders on a grand scale, a people who would forge a vast, multi-ethnic state that would become the very heart of the ancient world's first great global network. These were the Kushans. Their story, like that of so many peoples of this era, begins far away on the vast steppes to the northwest of China. They were a people known to Chinese historians as the Yuezhi, a powerful confederation of nomadic pastoralists. In the 2nd century BCE, driven from their ancestral lands by a rival tribal group, the Yuezhi began a long westward migration across Central Asia. This great movement of people was the domino that had pushed the Shakas into India in the first place. After a long journey, the Yuezhi settled in the rich lands of Bactria, the old Greek kingdom, and for about a century they consolidated their power. Then, in the 1st century CE, a leader from one of the 5 Yuezhi tribes, the Kushana, managed to unite all the tribes under his rule. This leader, Kujula Kadphises, then led his unified people across the Hindu Kush and into India, laying the foundations of the mighty Kushan Empire. The empire that the Kushans built was geographically unique. At its height, under its greatest rulers, it stretched from what is now Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, deep into the Gangetic Plain of northern India. This immense territory had one supreme strategic advantage. It sat directly astride the middle of the Silk Road. For the first time, a single political power controlled the vital nexus that connected the 4 great civilizations of the classical world: the Roman Empire in the west, the Parthian Empire in Persia, the Han Dynasty in China to the east, and the rich kingdoms of India to the south. The Kushans became the great intermediaries of this global trade network, and the wealth that flowed through their lands was simply staggering. Imagine the caravans that plied these routes, protected by Kushan soldiers. From China came the precious secret of silk, bolts of shimmering fabric that were worth more than their weight in gold in the markets of Rome. From the Roman Empire came gold coinage, fine glassware, and Mediterranean wines. From India flowed fragrant spices, precious gems like diamonds and pearls, fine cotton textiles, and exotic animals. And from Central Asia itself came the magnificent horses that were essential for the armies of the age. The Kushans grew fantastically wealthy and powerful by controlling, taxing, and securing this constant river of commerce. Their cities, like the capital Purushapura, modern Peshawar, became bustling cosmopolitan centers where merchants, monks, and mercenaries from a dozen different cultures rubbed shoulders. The greatest of the Kushan emperors was Kanishka, who ruled in the 2nd century CE. He was the perfect embodiment of the Kushan synthesis, a formidable warrior who expanded the empire to its greatest extent. He was also a man of sophisticated tastes and a great patron of religion and the arts. The coins minted during his reign are a mirror of his eclectic world, featuring a breathtakingly diverse pantheon of deities. You can find coins with Greek gods like Helios, Persian Zoroastrian deities like Mithra, Hindu gods like Shiva, and most frequently the Buddha. Kanishka, it seems, was a patron of all the faiths of his diverse empire. He is, however, most famously associated with his patronage of Buddhism. He convened the Fourth Buddhist Council in Kashmir, a major event that brought together hundreds of scholars to codify and systematize the doctrines of the emerging Mahayana school of Buddhism. It was under Kanishka's rule that this new form of Buddhism, with its expanded pantheon of compassionate bodhisattvas, truly began to flourish and spread along the trade routes his empire protected, eventually reaching China, Korea, and Japan. This patronage also gave rise to one of the most beautiful artistic traditions of the ancient world, the art of Gandhara. In the workshops of this region, for the first time in history, artisans began to depict the Buddha in human form, but they did so using the artistic vocabulary they had inherited from the Indo-Greeks. The result was a stunning Greco-Buddhist fusion. These Gandharan Buddhas have the serene, contemplative faces of Indian sages, but they are carved with the flowing toga-like robes and the wavy Apollonian hairstyles of Greek gods. It was the perfect art form for a perfect synthesis, a calm and compassionate Eastern philosophy rendered in a graceful and realistic Western style, a beautiful and enduring legacy of the empire that stood at the crossroads of the world. While the Kushan emperors were ruling their vast, cosmopolitan empire from the foothills of the Himalayas, becoming the masters of the Silk Road, an entirely different and equally impressive dynasty was flourishing in the heart of the Indian subcontinent. For the last few chapters of our story, our gaze has been fixed on the north, on the dramatic influx of new peoples and the great cultural fusion happening in the lands of the Punjab and the Ganges. But now we must turn our attention southward to the great triangular plateau of the Deccan, a land of rugged hills, fertile river valleys, and a coastline that opened onto the shimmering waters of the Indian Ocean. Here, in the centuries that followed the collapse of the Mauryan Empire, the first great indigenous empire of southern and central India rose to power, a dynasty that would rule for over 300 years, acting as a vital bridge between the turbulent north and the ancient cultures of the far south. This was the empire of the Satavahanas. The Satavahanas likely began their journey as Mauryan vassals, local governors, who in the chaos that followed Ashoka's death saw their opportunity to declare independence. They carved out a kingdom for themselves in the regions of modern-day Maharashtra and Andhra Pradesh, establishing a powerful state that would dominate the Deccan from the late 1st century BCE to the early 3rd century CE. For much of their history, they were contemporaries of the Kushans, and a great rivalry existed between the two powers. They acted as a crucial bulwark, a stabilizing force that prevented the northern invaders from pushing deeper into the south, thereby preserving the unique cultural identity of the southern Dravidian peoples while also selectively absorbing and transmitting influences from the north. They were the great gatekeepers of the Deccan Peninsula. Their power and immense wealth were built on two foundations: fertile agricultural land and, most importantly, lucrative trade. The Satavahana kingdom was perfectly positioned to dominate the burgeoning maritime commerce that was connecting India to the wider world. They controlled a string of important ports on both the western and eastern coasts, bustling harbor towns that were key nodes in the Indian Ocean trade network. From the west, ships from the Roman Empire would arrive, their hulls filled with amphorae of wine, fine red pottery, and chests of gold and silver coins, eager to trade for the fabled luxury of the East. From the Satavahana ports, they would depart with pepper and spices from the south, fine cotton and muslin textiles, and precious stones. The discovery of vast hoards of Roman coins in the territories of the Satavahanas bears silent witness to the scale and profitability of this long-distance trade. They were the southern masters of the sea lanes, just as the Kushans were the northern masters of the land routes. But the Satavahanas were not just powerful rulers. They had a unique and fascinating culture, distinguished by one particularly intriguing custom. We know the names of their greatest kings, powerful rulers like Satakarni the Milus, who performed the great Vedic horse sacrifices to celebrate his conquests, and Hala, who was a renowned poet. But perhaps their most famous ruler was a man who took the throne in the early 2nd century CE, a king who rescued the dynasty from its rivals and expanded its power to its greatest extent. His name was Gautamiputra Satakarni. Notice the first part of his name, Gautamiputra, meaning the son of Gautami. His successor was named Vasisthiputra Pulumavi, the son of Vasisthi. This is the Satavahana mystery. In a thoroughly patriarchal society where lineage and succession flowed through the male line, why did these mighty kings choose to identify themselves by their mother's name? It does not mean their society was a matriarchy. The throne still passed from father to son, but it strongly suggests that women, at least in the royal family, held a position of exceptional honor and prestige. Perhaps it was a way of navigating a complex system of marriage alliances between powerful clans, where the identity of the mother conferred a special status on the son. Whatever the reason, this matrilineal naming convention is a distinctive and gentle fingerprint of their dynasty, a quiet hint of a different social order, preserved in the long and formal titles of its kings. Like so many rulers of ancient India, the Satavahana kings were patrons of a diverse range of religious traditions. The rulers themselves were followers of the Brahmanical faith, reviving the performance of the grand Vedic sacrifices that had fallen out of favor under the Buddhist Mauryas. Yet at the same time, they were also among the greatest patrons of Buddhism. It was with their royal support that some of the most magnificent early Buddhist monuments in India were constructed, including the great stupa at Amaravati and the breathtaking rock-cut cave temples and monasteries at places like Karle and Nasik. Here, vast prayer halls and sanctuaries were carved directly out of the living rock of the Deccan Hills, monuments to a spirit of religious tolerance and a testament to the enduring power of the Buddhist faith among the merchants and artisans who grew wealthy under the stable and prosperous rule of the Satavahanas. For centuries after the fall of the Mauryas, the political story of India had been one of powerful outsiders, the Greeks, the Shakas, the Kushans, creating vibrant but ultimately foreign-led empires in the north, while the great Satavahana dynasty held sway in the Deccan. But by the middle of the 3rd century CE, these great powers were themselves in a state of terminal decline. The Kushan Empire had fractured, and the Satavahana realm had broken apart into smaller successor kingdoms. The subcontinent entered another of its periodic phases of political fragmentation, a quiet and murky era from which few grand historical narratives survive. It was a time of many small kings and no great emperors. But this fallow period, this political winter, was merely a resting phase, a time when the soil was being prepared for the seeds of the next great imperial spring. Out of this obscurity, from the very same lands of Magadha that had been the cradle of the Mauryan Empire, a new dynasty began its slow and patient ascent. At first, they were nothing remarkable, just one of many minor local ruling families struggling for influence. Unlike the Mauryas, who had seized control of a ready-made imperial state, this new dynasty had the humblest of beginnings, likely coming not from the priestly Brahmin or warrior Kshatriya class, but from the Vaishya class of landowners or merchants. Their origins are one of history's quiet mysteries. The first 2 rulers of this line, a man named Sri Gupta and his son Gatotkacha, are known to us only as names in the genealogies recorded by their far more famous descendants. They were not great emperors, but petty chieftains, local rajas who managed to carve out a small principality for themselves in the chaos of the post-Kushan world. No one at the time could have possibly guessed that this minor provincial family was destined to preside over India's next great golden age. The founder of the dynasty's imperial fortunes was Gatotkacha's son, who came to the throne around 320 CE. He bore a name that echoed with historical grandeur, Chandragupta. Though he was no relation to the great Chandragupta Maurya, he was possessed of a similar ambition and strategic genius. He understood that in a fractured landscape, the quickest path to power was not always through the sword, but through a brilliant alliance. He secured a marriage with a princess named Kumara Devi from the ancient and powerful Lichchavi clan. You may remember the Lichchavis as the leading members of the Vajjian Confederacy, that great republic that had been so powerful in the time of the Buddha. This marriage was a masterstroke. It brought Chandragupta not only territory and military support, but also immense prestige and the legitimacy of an ancient aristocratic lineage. He was so proud of this alliance that he issued special gold coins depicting himself and his Lichchavi queen. With his power base secured, he was the first of his line to assume the grand imperial title of Maharaja, the great king of kings, a clear declaration that a new paramount power had arrived in northern India. What Chandragupta I founded through diplomacy, his son, Samudragupta, would expand through relentless conquest. Samudragupta, who reigned for nearly half a century, was one of the most brilliant military commanders in Indian history, a man whose ambition was to bring the entire subcontinent under his authority to become a true Chakravartin, or universal ruler. Our knowledge of his incredible campaigns comes from a glowing panegyric carved by a wonderful historical coincidence on the very same stone pillar in Allahabad that also bears the peaceful edicts of Ashoka. This inscription, written by his court poet, lists in breathtaking detail the sheer scope of his conquests. The poet tells us that Samudragupta completely uprooted 9 kings in the northern heartland of Aryavarta, the Gangetic Plain, annexing their kingdoms directly into his growing empire. He then launched a spectacular campaign deep into the south, the Dakshinapatha, where he defeated 12 different rulers. But here he showed a shrewd political wisdom. Knowing that it would be impossible to control these distant southern kingdoms directly, he showed them grace, liberating and reinstating the defeated kings, who then became his loyal vassals, sending him tribute and acknowledging his overlordship. The inscription goes on to say that the frontier kingdoms and the tribal republics on the edges of the empire were so awed by his power that they voluntarily submitted, paying homage to him without a fight. Even foreign kings, such as the remnants of the Kushans in the northwest and the king of Sri Lanka, were said to have sent him tribute and embassies. But Samudragupta was not merely as a warrior. The inscription praises him as a man of culture, a gifted poet and musician, and some of his beautiful gold coins depict him peacefully playing the veena, a stringed instrument. He was the perfect embodiment of the new Gupta ideal, a conqueror with the soul of a poet, a warrior king who laid the military foundations for an age of unprecedented peace, prosperity, and breathtaking cultural achievement. The vast empire forged by the conquests of Samudragupta created something that India had not experienced for over 500 years, a long and profound peace. With the subcontinent's heartland unified and its frontiers secure, the immense wealth of the kingdom could be channeled away from the constant demands of warfare and towards the cultivations of the mind and the spirit. The reign of Samudragupta's son and successor, Chandragupta II, who ruled for nearly 40 years from about 375 to 415 CE, is often seen as the absolute zenith of this classical age. Under his stable and prosperous rule, India witnessed an intellectual and artistic efflorescence of such breathtaking brilliance that it is remembered forever as the nation's golden age. It was an era of supreme confidence and boundless creativity, a time when geniuses in fields as diverse as mathematics, astronomy, literature, and art created works that would define the standards of Indian culture for a millennium and fundamentally alter the course of science and philosophy across the world. Nowhere was this genius more apparent than in the fields of mathematics and astronomy. In cities like Ujjain, which became a great center for scientific thought, brilliant minds turned their attention to the heavens and the abstract world of numbers. The greatest of these thinkers was a man named Aryabhata. In the late 5th century CE, he wrote a treatise that contained a series of truly revolutionary ideas. He correctly proposed that the Earth is a sphere that rotates on its axis once a day, which is what causes the apparent daily movement of the stars. He understood that the moon has no light of its own, but shines by reflecting the light of the sun. Using this insight, he was able to offer a correct and purely scientific explanation for both solar and lunar eclipses, dismissing the old mythological tales of a demon swallowing the sun or moon. In a world where most civilizations still believed in a flat earth at the center of the universe, these were astonishing leaps of scientific intuition and mathematical reasoning. But the most significant and enduring contribution of the Gupta age was the development of a system of mathematics that would change the world forever. It was here that Indian mathematicians perfected the decimal system of numerals from 1 to 9 that we still use today. And most crucially, they made a conceptual leap of staggering importance: the invention of the number 0, which they called shunya, meaning emptiness or void. 0 was not just a placeholder to distinguish 10 from 100, as some earlier systems had used it. For the Indian thinkers, it was a number in its own right, a value that could be used in calculations. This single invention was the key that unlocked modern mathematics. Without 0, there is no simple arithmetic, no algebra, no calculus, no computer science. It was one of the most important intellectual breakthroughs in all of human history, a gift from Gupta India that quietly underpins the entire scientific and technological world we live in today. This age of scientific brilliance was matched by a golden age of literature. This was the period when Sanskrit, the ancient language of the Vedas, was polished into a perfect vehicle for sophisticated poetry and drama. The undisputed master of this classical Sanskrit, the Shakespeare of ancient India, was the poet and playwright Kalidasa. And here we find another quiet mystery. Despite being the most celebrated writer in Indian history, we know almost nothing for certain about the man himself. We have his sublime works, but the details of his life are lost, leaving only a legend that he was one of the 9 gems of brilliant minds at the court of Chandragupta II. His most famous work is the romantic play The Recognition of Shakuntala, a beautiful and poignant tale of love, separation, and reunion between a king and a forest maiden. The play is celebrated for the sheer beauty of its poetry, its deep and loving descriptions of the natural world, and its profound insight into the subtleties of human emotion. Kalidasa's work set the standard for elegance, grace, and emotional depth that would be emulated by Indian writers for centuries to come. This creative energy also expressed itself in stone and metal. It was during the Gupta period that a new distinctively Indian style of sculpture emerged. Moving away from the Greco-Buddhist influences of the Kushan era, Gupta artists created images of the Buddha and Hindu gods that are renowned for their serene, spiritual beauty, their graceful postures, and their almost translucent quality. It was also the age that saw the construction of the first permanent, freestanding Hindu temples. And perhaps the most tangible symbol of the age's scientific prowess still stands today in Delhi, a 7-meter-high iron pillar erected in the 4th century. It is a testament to the incredible skill of Gupta metallurgists, for in over 1600 years of exposure to the elements, it has scarcely rusted, a quiet and enduring monument to an age of pure genius. This brilliant flowering of science and art during the Gupta Golden Age was not a purely secular affair. It was deeply intertwined with a parallel flourishing in the religious sphere. The same creative energy that produced the concept of zero and the sublime poetry of Kalidasa was also at work reimagining the spiritual landscape of India. For centuries, the ancient Brahmanical faith had been challenged, first by the intellectual inquiries of the Upanishadic sages, and then by the popular appeal of the great alternative paths of Buddhism and Jainism. The Gupta period was the age in which the Brahmanical tradition responded to these challenges, absorbing new ideas, embracing new forms of worship, and transforming itself into the rich, multifaceted, and deeply devotional faith that we now recognize as classical Hinduism. The most fundamental shift was a move away from the centrality of the great public sacrifice, the yajna. You'll remember that in the old Vedic religion, the fire sacrifice, performed with meticulous precision by Brahmin priests, was the primary way that humans interacted with the gods. But this was a path that was exclusive, complex, and expensive. During the Gupta era, while these rituals certainly continued under royal patronage, a new and far more personal form of worship became the heart of the religion. This was the path of bhakti, or loving personal devotion to a chosen deity. Bhakti taught that salvation could be achieved not just through priestly ritual or deep philosophical knowledge, but through simple, heartfelt love and surrender to a god. This path was open to anyone and everyone, regardless of their caste, wealth, or gender. It transformed the religious experience from a formal, public transaction into an intimate, emotional relationship between the devotee and the divine. The central act of worship was no longer the fire sacrifice, but the puja, the offering of flowers, incense, food, and prayers to an image, a murti, of a deity housed within a temple. This shift towards personal devotion was accompanied by a transformation of the divine itself. The old, nature-based gods of the Vedas, like the thunder-wielding Indra and the sky god Varuna, began to recede into the background. In their place, a new conception of the divine rose to prominence, centered on a handful of supreme deities who commanded the fierce loyalty and love of their followers. The most important of these were organized into the Great Trinity, the Trimurti, which represented the three fundamental forces of the cosmos. There was Brahma, the creator, a distant, four-headed deity who brought the universe into being. Then there was Vishnu, the preserver, a benevolent and compassionate God who watches over the world and in times of great crisis, when darkness threatens to overwhelm the good, descends to earth in a series of incarnations or avatars. These avatars, like the heroic Prince Rama and the wise and playful cowherd god Krishna, made Vishnu an immensely popular and relatable figure, a god who actively participated in the human story. The third member of the Trinity was Shiva, the destroyer, but his role was not one of simple negativity. He was the great ascetic, the lord of the yogis, who represented the power of transformation, the destruction of the old that is necessary for the creation of the new. He was both the most terrifying and the most merciful of the gods, the lord of the cosmic dance of creation and destruction. Alongside these great male deities, the Gupta age also saw the rise to supreme importance of the goddess, Devi, or Shakti, the embodiment of divine feminine power, worshipped in a multitude of forms, from the gentle and benevolent Parvati, the consort of Shiva, to the fierce and terrifying demon-slaying Durga. To make this new, devotional Hinduism accessible to all, this was the age in which the vast oral traditions of India were finally collected, edited, and written down in their classical Sanskrit form. This was the period that gave us the Puranas, a collection of 18 major texts that are a veritable encyclopedia of Hindu mythology. The Puranas told the stories of the gods and goddesses in vivid, entertaining detail, explaining their origins, their cosmic battles, and their interactions with humanity. They were a way of transmitting complex philosophical ideas through the much more accessible and memorable medium of storytelling. It was also during this period that India's two monumental epic poems, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, were given their final, definitive form. Those sprawling tales of war, love, and the struggle for righteousness, which had been recited by bards for centuries, were now edited into the epic masterpieces we know today, weaving together heroic narratives with deep discussions of philosophy, morality, and the path of devotion, creating the foundational stories for 1 billion people. The magnificent cultural edifice of classical Hinduism, with its beloved gods and its epic stories, was built within the peaceful and prosperous sanctuary of the Gupta Empire. For over a century and a half, the dynasty had provided the stability and the patronage that allowed art, science, and philosophy to flourish to an unprecedented degree. But this golden age, like the Mauryan peace that had preceded it, was a fragile creation, dependent on the strength of its frontiers and the wisdom of its rulers. As the 5th century CE wore on, the serene confidence of the high Gupta period began to waver, and the first shadows of a long twilight started to fall across the land. A storm was gathering far to the northwest, a storm of nomadic warriors who would hammer against the gates of the empire, while from within, the slow, inexorable forces of decay began to pull the great imperial structure apart. The long reign of Chandragupta II's successor, Kumaragupta III, was for the most part a continuation of the peace and prosperity of the Golden Age. For 40 years, the empire remained intact and seemingly untroubled, but near the very end of his rule, the first tremors of the coming earthquake were felt. A powerful tribal group within the empire rose in a serious rebellion, threatening the dynasty's heartland. At the same time, a new and far more dangerous enemy appeared for the first time on the northwestern frontier. They were a fierce and nomadic people from the steppes of Central Asia, a people known to the Indians as the Hunas. The initial Huna invasion was met and decisively repelled by the crown prince, Skandagupta, a gifted general who in a great battle threw back the invaders and saved the empire, earning him comparisons to the great Samudragupta. When Skandagupta came to the throne, it seemed that the glory of the Guptas was secure. But the victory had been a costly one, and the Hunas were not a threat that could be defeated just once. Who were these Hunas? This is one of history's intriguing questions. They were part of the great wave of nomadic migrations that were disrupting settled civilizations all across Eurasia at this time. They are often connected to the Huns, who, under their famous leader Attila, were simultaneously striking terror into the heart of the Roman Empire in Europe. While they were likely part of the same broad nomadic movement, the specific group that invaded India is more accurately identified by modern historians as the Hephthalites, or the White Huns. They were a confederation of warlike clans, masters of horsemanship and the composite bow, a people whose entire culture was organized for rapid, destructive warfare. They swept down from the mountains of Central Asia, overwhelming the last remnants of the Kushan kingdom and establishing a base in what is now Afghanistan, from which they could launch their raids deep into the rich plains of India. Their arrival marked a definitive and brutal end to the long Gupta peace. Though Skandagupta had been victorious in his initial battles, the relentless pressure of the Huna Wars began to take a heavy toll on the empire. Maintaining large armies permanently stationed on the frontier was a ruinous expense for the imperial treasury. The beautiful gold coins of the Guptas, which had been a symbol of their wealth and stability, began to decline in purity and weight, a sure sign of a state under severe financial distress. The constant warfare also disrupted the vital overland trade routes that connected India to Persia and beyond, cutting off a major source of the empire's wealth. This immense external pressure was magnified by a growing internal weakness. It is the classic story of imperial decline. The successors who followed the capable Skandagupta were, for the most part, a series of less competent and less powerful rulers. As the authority of the emperor in Pataliputra began to wane, the powerful feudatory lords and provincial governors who administered the empire's vast territories began to assert their own power. They saw the emperor struggling to fend off the Hunas and decided it was the perfect time to stop sending their tax revenues to the capital and to begin ruling their own lands as independent, hereditary kings. The empire was dying a slow death by 1,000 cuts, its authority draining away to the provinces, even as its armies were being bled dry on the frontier. In the early years of the 6th century, the Hunas broke through. Under their powerful leaders, Toramana and his notoriously cruel son, Mihirakula, they swept across the Punjab and into the heart of central India, conquering vast territories and leaving a trail of destruction. Although the Huna Empire in India would itself prove to be short-lived, the damage they inflicted was fatal. They had shattered the military and economic backbone of the Gupta state. By the middle of the 6th century, the mighty Gupta Empire, which had presided over India's classical Golden Age, had been reduced to a minor, insignificant kingdom, ruling over a small patch of its former territory before fading from history altogether. The great unity was broken. The light of the Golden Age had flickered and died, and India was once again a fractured land of warring states. The fall of the Guptas plunged northern India back into a familiar state of political disarray, a patchwork of regional kingdoms that would squabble and compete for centuries to come. The great imperial unity that had twice been forged, first by the Mauryas and then by the Guptas, was once again a distant memory. And so, our long journey through the story of ancient India, from its mysterious dawn in the silent cities of the Indus Valley to the twilight of its classical Golden Age, now comes to a gentle close. The great empires have crumbled to dust. Their grand capitals have been reclaimed by the earth, and the names of their mighty kings have become the stuff of legend. But to see this as an ending is to miss the most important truth. The true legacy of ancient India was never confined to the lifespan of its empires. It was a legacy of ideas, a series of profound and enduring contributions to the human story that would outlast every throne and every fortress, flowing like quiet rivers across the world to nourish civilizations yet to come. Perhaps the most profound of these legacies was a unique and persistent focus on the inner world of the human mind. From the deep philosophical inquiries of the Upanishadic sages through the compassionate awakening of the Buddha and the austere discipline of Mahavira, ancient Indian thought was constantly exploring the great questions of consciousness, suffering, and the nature of reality. It gave the world the powerful, interconnected concepts of karma, the universal law of moral cause and effect, of samsara, the vast repeating cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, and of moksha or nirvana, the ultimate goal of liberation from this cycle. These ideas would form the bedrock of India's great spiritual traditions, which offered diverse paths to this ultimate freedom. There was the path of bhakti within Hinduism, a journey of loving devotion to a personal God. There was the path of Buddhism, a middle way of mindfulness, ethical conduct, and wisdom. And there was the path of Jainism, a demanding road of absolute nonviolence and purification of the soul. These were not just religions, but sophisticated psychologies of the mind that would go on to shape the lives of billions of people across Asia and eventually the entire world. Alongside this legacy of the spirit was an equally brilliant legacy of the mind. The intellectual ferment of the Gupta Golden Age, in particular, produced scientific and mathematical breakthroughs that would prove to be foundational for our modern world. Remember the quiet genius of the Indian mathematicians who perfected the decimal system and gave us the concept of zero or shunya. This was not merely a clever invention, it was a conceptual revolution. This idea, this symbol for both nothingness and a placeholder of infinite potential, was slowly transmitted westward. It was picked up by Arab mathematicians who combined it with the Indian numerals, which is why we often call them Arabic numerals. And from the Islamic world, it eventually made its way to Europe in the late Middle Ages. It was this efficient and powerful system of calculation that fueled the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and every technological advance that has followed. Every time we use a computer, check our bank balance, or calculate a trajectory to the stars, we are using the quiet, anonymous gift of those ancient Indian thinkers. The legacy also lives in the realm of stories and culture. The two great epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, which were given their final form in the classical age, became more than just literature. They became the cultural DNA of the subcontinent and much of Southeast Asia, a vast repository of myths, moral dilemmas, and cultural values that continue to be retold, reinterpreted, and loved to this day. The political science of Chanakya's Arthashastra, for all its cold pragmatism, remained a foundational text on statecraft for Indian rulers for 1,000 years. The artistic vision of the Gupta sculptors, with their serene and graceful depictions of the divine, created a visual language for spirituality that still endures. And so, As we leave this ancient world behind, we can see that its story is not truly over. It is a tale of empires that rose and fell, of cities built and abandoned, of battles won and lost. But it is also the story of the discovery of nonviolence, the search for enlightenment, the telling of timeless stories, and the invention of the number that makes all our modern science possible. These are the threads that have been woven into the fabric of our world, the quiet and enduring legacy of a civilization that for 3,000 years never stopped questioning, creating, and dreaming. And now, as the echoes of these ancient voices fade, may your own mind find its peace. May you rest, and may your dreams be filled with a quiet sense of wonder.